All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Let us begin. We want to begin by thanking our sponsor, our Talmud Torah sponsors of the month of Elul, and Faith Wolf and family for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashas in memory of their beloved father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, Cyrus Wolf, Shalom ben Tzvi Hirsch. And our Daf Yomi sponsors today, Alan and Sue Meyrowitz, in memory of Alan's grandmother, Anna Smith, Henya Rachel Bas Shimshon Zichron Livrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an aliyah and the families in Nechama. And Rabbi, so with that, let us begin. We have an incredible daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Lamed Aleph 31. We are picking up on Lamed Amud Beis 30b, and we are picking up at Ulakoin Bebeis Hapras. So it's about 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, the Mishnah said that a Kohen is permitted to go ahead and deposit his Eruv in a Beis Hapras. So remember again, what's a Beis Hapras? So we already saw this in the Mishnah. Look at Rashi. Actually, before we're not up to Rashi yet. Beis Hapras is a field in which you know there was a grave. The field was plowed over. I don't know the location of the grave. So what's the concern in a field like that? The concern generally is that halacha l'maisa, one may come to step on a bone fragment and not even realize that they are doing so. That's the concern in a Beis Hapras. Yet the Mishnah said that a Kohen is permitted to place his Eruv in a Beis Hapras. So what's the pshat? So it says the Gemara, the Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Menafeach Adam Beis Hapras v'holech. So we'll see, interestingly enough, because how do you deal with the Beis Hapras? So it's a bit arduous, but what you can do is every time you take a step on the Beis Hapras, you blow the dirt in front of you. So the assumption is that if there is a bone fragment, the bone fragment will be towards the top of the soil because the field's been plowed. So all you need to do is to blow on the soil, blow on the dirt, and you'll expose whatever bone fragment there is. So if you look at Rashi, so if you have a field in which there was a plowed grave, the kula sveika mishumat samasi. And if Rabbi say because the field was plowed and there was a grave there, there's a suffix on the entire field about whether or not there are bone fragments. The Gemara says, "Kula sveika mishumat samasi va'atzamas below basra einu matami ba'oel u'kshenafeach lifnei raglov im yesham etzam gadol nira me'elav ve'etzam katam nira beneficha ve'einu masito b'raglov." So therefore, Rabbi say you blow on the dirt. If it's a large bone fragment, you'll see it because it'll jut out. And if it's a small bone fragment, then halacha l'maisa, by blowing on the dirt, it will expose anything that may be there. So since a Kohen could technically access his Eruv in a Beis Hapras, again, a bit arduous and a bit difficult, he's going to have to blow on the dirt every step he takes. But since that's possible, therefore halacha l'maisa, he could deposit his Eruv there. Yehuda bar Ami Mishmei Derav Yehuda Amar Beis Hapras Sheni Dashtar. Okay, I will say there's another opinion. The other opinion says that halacha l'maisa, any field that had a grave in it and it was plowed, the field is tahar. What does that mean? Rashi says because if it was plowed, we're confident that any bone fragments that were there have been reduced to less than the size of a kernel of grain. That's the size at which a bone fragment will convey tumah. If it's been plowed, we're confident that the bone fragments have been crumbled to a smaller shear than that. Good. Rabbi Yehuda says, even if the Kohen deposited his Eruv in a cemetery, halacha l'maisa, it is a good Eruv. How can that be? He can't access it. Tana mipnei sheyachal lachos v'leilech b'shida teva umigdal. So Rabbi says, since there is the ability for the Kohen to go ahead and access his Eruv, how? If he's transported into the cemetery in a box. Let's say he's in some type of box, which essentially serves as a mechitza. If he's in some type of box or some type of wagon, he could enter into the cemetery. The box or the wagon then acts as a mechitza. Literally, shade the teva migdal means like a closet, right? A closet or a chest. So if he goes in there, ultimately again, that box or that chest is chotzeitz mipnei hatumah. It serves as a mechitza in front of the tumah. So the Gemara Kasavar, ohel zvok shmei ohel. And I will say now it must be that opinion holds that a movable ohel, a movable tent, is considered to be a tent. So it says we're going to say this is the subject of machlokes. So we're plugged to the Hani Tanoi. The Sanya, because we learned hanichnas la'eretz ha'amim. We'll say if a person goes into Eretz Ha'amim. Now Eretz Ha'amim refers to any land outside of Eretz Yisrael. Outside of Eretz Yisrael. Then I will say any land outside of Eretz Yisrael there is considered to be a general rabbinic tumah. Now the reason for that is because the rabbis were concerned that in outside lands, they were not careful about where they buried people. In Eretz Yisrael, they were careful where they buried people. Graves were clearly marked, clearly delineated. Outside of Eretz Yisrael, the concern was there were a lot of random burials. As such, there was a rabbinic gezerah that whenever you go into lands outside of Eretz Yisrael, there is tumah. Now watch this. The Gemara says, so someone goes out to the lands outside of Eretz Yisrael, and they go out, b'shida, teva, umigdal, they go out in a chest, or in a dresser, right, or in a box. So what's the halacha? Rebbe mitame, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda mitar. Rebbe says you're tameh, and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda says you're tahar. But my community, you're both say, what's the subject of machlokis over here? Mar savar ohel zrok lav shmei ohel. So one opinion says that a movable tent is not called a tent. Right? He holds, will say that the definition of an ohel is something stationary. If it's not stationary, then halacha lamaisa, it is not an ohel. Umar savar ohel zrok shmei ohel. And the other opinion says no, that even a movable ohel has the status of an ohel. And I both say perhaps that's the machlokis over here that plays out here. Can you go ahead and deposit an eruv in a beis hapras? So again, in a beis hakvaros. So the opinion that says yes is because it is accessible to the kohen. How could a kohen get into a cemetery? Transport him in a receptacle that is a mechitza in front of the tumah. That only works if you hold that ohel zrok, a movable ohel, is a proper ohel. Whereas the other opinion will say, no, kohen can't access it because he holds that a movable ohel is not called an ohel. So the Gemara says, "V'hadasanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer," but that's what Rabbi Yehuda says. Top of Lamed Aleph, Ma'arvin lekohen tahar b'shuma tahora b'kever. So supposed to listen to this. So we said before that you can go ahead and make an eruv for a kohen who is tahar with truma that is tahora, even if you deposit it in a cemetery. So the Gemara says, how is the kohen going to access that truma? If you look at Rashi just a moment, Rashi says, Ma'arvin lekohen tahar b'truma tahora b'kever v'chosh kem b'chulin dinami mitmu chazul afilu b'truma di'imetam. So how are you going to access it? Hechi azal b'shida tevo migdal. So the Gemara says, okay, very simple. We just said, how is the kohen going to access it? You transport him, Rabbi say, in a movable ohel. And that movable ohel is chotzeitz b'fnei hatumah. It serves as a partition in front of the tumah. The hakevan da'achsa itmala. But I will say 1 second. As soon as you go ahead, if you look at Rashi, Rashi says right across in Rashi. Kolomar nehid v'Rabbi Yehuda afilu beis hakvaros ikatakanta lemezol b'shid teva migdal t'koshkin kever yechidi shechal lamod eslo elamir truma hechi ancha hasam metami by hilo shel kever. Sibos says, okay, I got it. I understand how a kohen could get into a cemetery. Okay, I understand. A shida teva migdal, take them in a box. The box is right. The box serves as a mechitza, and as long as you hold that a movable ohel is an ohel, we're good to go. But both say, but doesn't the truma itself become tameh once it's being placed on a grave? Remember, in this case over here, it says you can make an eruv for a kohen who's tahar with truma that's tahora, even if you place the truma on the grave. But if you're placing the truma on the grave, the truma itself becomes tameh. Right? To both say again, anything that hovers over a grave becomes tameh with the tumah of the grave. So doesn't the truma become tameh? To which, and Rosa, remember, if the truma is tameh, then what? Then it's not really edible by the kohen. And if it's not edible by the kohen, in case the truma is tameh, it's not really edible by anyone. And therefore, how could it be a good eruv? To which the Gemara says, B'shalo huchshira, o sheni lusha b'mei peros. What's the case? The case is where the truma was not huchshira. Both remember again, in order for any produce to be able to be makabel tumah, it has to come in contact with a liquid. If it hasn't come in contact with a liquid, then it's not receptive to tumah. Or we could be talking about truma that was already processed, but processed with fruit juices. Fruit juices are not one of the liquids that allow for tumah receptivity. So the answer the Gemara essentially gives is that this particular truma in question is impervious to tumah. We'll say again, this is tumah 101, right? We know this, that halacha l'maisa, in order for an item to become tameh, it has to be huchshar, it has to be receptive. The way it becomes receptive is through contact with one of the 7 liquids. So either we're talking about truma that never came in contact with a liquid, or it came in contact with a liquid. What type of liquid? Fruit juices, and fruit juices are not one of the 7 liquids. So I will say, so now I got it, how the truma could still remain tahora, even though it's sitting, it's a good conversation, right? Can you ever have a case where truma could be on a grave and yet it's still tar? And you could say, funny you should ask. Eruvin Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph happens to have that exact case. Ve'echi ma'isila. So I'm going to say 1 second. Here's the other problem. So how does the Kohen go ahead and get the truma? How does he get the truma? Well, say look at Rashi, which is moment. Ve'echi ma'isila la'ochla dehara Yehuda roi la'ochla by midinake tar b'torah velo echsher tamei b'torah mishum dechaz lachrini. Supposedly, here's the other issue. How does the Kohen get it? Because if the Kohen reaches his hand out of the wagon to go ahead and get the truma, and his hand is over the grave, does that not convey tumah to the Kohen? To which the Gemara says, "B'pshute kli'etz delo mekabli tumah." Very interesting, because they both say, what does he use? He uses a wooden utensil which does not have a receptacle. So wooden utensils do not have a receptacle. It's called pshute kli'etz, literally flat wooden utensils, no receptacle, are not mekabel tumah. So therefore, he gets the truma with a pshute kli'etz. But 1 second. Even though it might be true that the pshute kli'etz, the kli itself is not makabel tumah, both say if that wooden utensil is on top, hovers over the grave, it forms an ohel. If it forms an ohel, then anything under the ohel and anything attached to the ohel, including the Kohen's hand, is going to become tameh. So doesn't the Kohen become tameh like that? To which the Gemara says, "Demaisila achure." He goes in and he picks up the truma with the narrow part of the pshute kli'etz, with the narrow part of halacha lemaisa of the utensil, and therefore again it doesn't have a tefach. I will say only a utensil that has the width of a tefach has the ability to serve as an ohel. So he's going ahead and using the narrow part of the pshute kli'etz. So the Gemara said, so you hear what's going on over here? So the Kohen who's tar, is using truma tahora as his eruv, and where is he depositing it? He's depositing it on top of a grave. How does he access it? Well, the Kohen himself has to be in an ohel, in some type of movable tent, some type of movable mechitza. He's going to fetch it through a wooden utensil with no receptacle, using the back end of the narrow part of the receptacle, which is less than a tefach, thereby does not serve as an ohel. That's how he retrieves his eruv. Bottom line, just choose a different location. I mean, that's the takeaway message. But okay, but you see how it could work. Ihachi, my time with the Rabbanon. So we'll say if that's the case, then why do the Rabbanon answer this? In other words, it seems like a pretty, or we'll say, obviously it's a little bit of a convoluted case, but lemaisa it works. So if it works, why do the Rabbanon have a problem with it? Watch this. The Gemara says, "Kasavi asr liknos bayis bi'isuri hano," because the Rabbanon holds Rabbanon say there's a problem. The problem is, remember, your home is where your grave is. Just remember again, what type of eruv are we talking about over here? We're talking about an eruv tchumen, right? You're trying to extend your Shabbos tchum. So how does eruv tchumen work? So wherever you place your food, that's where your home is. In this case, I will say, what are you making your home? What are you making your home? A grave. A grave is aser ba'na. You are not permitted to get hana from anything related to the dead. Right? Not the casket, not the tachrichim, not the burial place, nothing. So the Rabbanon will say this case doesn't work not because of tumah. We can navigate and figure out the tumah issues. The issue over here is that you're making your makom shvisa, you're making your domicile the top of a grave, and you can't do that. That's using something that's aser ba'ano. Mechlad Rabbi Yehuda savar mutar. So we'll say, does that mean Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa you can get hana from a grave? You can get hana from isuri. You can get hana from isuri hana. To which the Gemara says, kasavar mitzvos lav lehanos nitnu. So we'll say this is actually very interesting. So Rabbi Yossi holds that halacha l'maisa mitzvos are not considered hana. Now I will say this is going to touch on another fascinating machlokas, which we're going to see in just a moment, which is, under what circumstances are you permitted to extend your Tchum Shabbos? So we're going to be able to say that this is a fundamental machlokes. It's actually, this is not the sugya. We're going to see the sugya later on. But it's a fundamental machlokes. Is it just for Dvar Mitzvah that you could extend your Tchum? Or you could extend your Tchum for anything you want? Rabbi Yehuda apparently holds that halacha l'maisa, you could only extend your Tchum for Dvar Mitzvah. If that's the case, then the use of a grave is not called hana, because anything you do for a mitzvah, that's not called hana. Hana means some type of non-spiritual benefit. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda will say the use of a grave to establish a makom shvisa for a tchum Shabbos, for eruv tchumen, where the only reason you could set up an eruv tchumen is to perform a dvar mitzvah, that's not called hana. So the Gemara says, Elohada Amarava mitzvos lav lehanos nitnu lema kitanai amar l'shmaitei. So we'll say when Rava said that mitzvos are not hana, is that subject to a machlokes tanoim? So the Gemara says, Rashi says over here, Had Rava b'meseches Rosh Hashanah token b'shofar shel ola. So Rava says actually in Yonei Dioma, so there's a discussion about whether or not you could use the horn of an ola offering. Can I use the shofar of an ola? So Rava says, machlokes there. So one says you can't because that is hana with kachim. The other opinion says, no, not true. There's mitzvos lav lechanos nitnu. We'll say, I want to point out what this means. What this means is the performance of a mitzvah is not called in halacha hana. Hana is a very specific definition which refers to what? Personal benefit. Personal self-serving benefit. The performance of a mitzvah, of course, is of benefit to me. I've discharged an obligation, but it does not satisfy the criteria of halachic hana. So the Gemara says, this is machlokes. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava, no. Isvir lehu de'in ma'arvin elo dvar mitzvah dekuli alma mitzvah slav lehanos nitnu. So Rava says like this. No, everyone agrees with the concept of mitzvos lav lehanos nitnu. Let's assume that for a moment. Everyone agrees that the hana you get from a mitzvah is not halachic hana. The machlokes I will say over here is under what circumstances can you make an eruv tchumen? So Rava will say like this: if everyone would hold that you could only make an eruv for a dvar mitzvah, which is really fascinating, that you can't just extend your tchum whenever you want, right? You want to take a spatzir, so a longer walk, so you want to go to, you can't do that. Eruv tchumen is there to go ahead and enlarge the tchum for specific spiritual, religious purposes. So if you would hold that way, then enachinami, then you would also mitzvos lav lehanos nitnu. Everyone apparently subscribes to that idea, and therefore you would be able to put the eruv tchumen on a grave, because that would not be considered to be getting hana from the grave. That's hana from a mitzvah, and hana from a mitzvah is not considered to be halachic hana. So the Gemara says, "V'hacha b'hacha miflagi." This is the argument. Mar savar ein ma'avin elo dvar mitzvah. So Rabbi Yehuda holds that halacha l'maisa, the only time you can make an eruv is for a dvar mitzvah. Umar savar ma'arvin afilu dvar harishos, versus the Rabbanon who say no, you can make an eruv tchumen rabosei for whatever purpose you want. Oh, so now I understand the machlokes. Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that you can only make an eruv tchumen for a dvar mitzvah, allows you to put the eruv on a grave. Why? Because aren't you benefited from the grave? To which no, mitzvos lav lehanos nitnu. Since the only license you have to make an eruv is for the performance of a mitzvah. Mitzvahs are not considered to be normative hana. That's not hana, halachic hana. Therefore, you could use the grave as the makom shvisa for your eruv. But the Rabbanon who hold that you can make an eruv in any circumstance you want. Under those circumstances, then enachinami, I can't use a grave because that may be using a grave for my own mundane purposes. So the Gemara says, Alahad Amrav Yosef in ma'arvin elo dvar mitzvah. Lema kietanai amr l'shmaisei. So both say, so when Rabbi Yosef says that you can only make an eruv for a dvar mitzvah, that seems to be subject to a machlokes tanoim as well. Amr Rabbi Yosef, no. The kuli alma ein ma'arvin elo dvar mitzvah. So Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yosef's position is, everyone agrees that you could only make an eruv for a dvar mitzvah. Ud the kuli alma mitzvos lav lehanos nitnu. Everyone also agrees that what? Mitzvos were not given for hana purposes. We'll say, so again, we're going to see all of these things are subject to machlokes. This is how in Rav Yosef's construct, everyone subscribes to these two principles. Number one, you can only make an eruv for a dvar mitzvah. Again, I will say, I'm not saying that halacha l'maisa, so we're going to see this sugya. But number one, you can only make an eruv for a dvar mitzvah. Number two, benefit from mitzvos is not called hana. So both say, so what's the machlokes? Ubahaka miflagi. Mar savar kevan dekana le'eruv lo nechalei demintera. So we'll say one opinion holds that once you establish your makoshi, so remember again, when does an eruv take effect? When does it take effect? Ben hashmashas, right? Twilight on Friday, right? Friday going into Shabbos, that's when your eruv takes effect. So one opinion holds that once your eruv takes effect, you don't really care what happens to the food, which Rabbi say is we're going to see is the halacha that by eruv tchumen actually the food need not be in existence throughout the entirety of Shabbos. Once that eruv takes effect ben hashmashas, you're good. So one opinion holds, therefore, I don't really care what happens to the eruv food. As long as it was there over the course at ben hashmashas, I'm good. It lasts, it doesn't last, doesn't matter to me. Look at Rashi. Kevan de kanala Eruv ben Hashmoshos sulo ichpas le benitiruse. Once the Eruv kind of kicks in at ben Hashmoshos, I don't care what happens to the Eruv food after that. Va'ad knias Eruv inami nechale lav hana. So listen to this. So because I don't care what happens to the Eruv food, it's not considered to be as if I'm getting any type of benefit from the grave. Versus, however, the Gemara says, Umar Savar Nechale Demintira, the Itztarech Achele. The other opinion holds that no, I want the Eruv food to be properly guarded by the grave. Why? Because it's good to have a backup plan. In the event that I don't have any other Shabbos food, I know that at least what? I know that I have that Eruv food. So I will say, so this is quite fascinating. So the way the Gemara is setting this up, the way Rav Yosef is setting this up is as follows. In Rav Yosef's model, everyone agrees, number one, that you only make an Eruv for a Devar Mitzvah. Number two, everyone agrees, mitzvos lav lehanos nitnu. So what's the machlokes, Rabbi Huda and the Rabbanan? The machlokes is Rabbi saying, does a person desire the continued existence of their Eruv food? According to Rabbi Huda, no, I don't care. I don't care what happens to the Eruv food. As long as it was Zeh ben Hashmoshos, I don't care what happens to it. Therefore, I'm not getting any benefit from the grave. Therefore, it's totally permitted. According to the Rabbanan, I want the continued existence of the Eruv food. Why? It's a backup plan. In the event that my Shabbos food gets lost, gets stolen, gets burnt, whatever else, at least I know I have a backup meal. And having the backup meal is of significance to me, and therefore that's called getting benefits from the grave. I want the grave to continue, so to speak, to guard the food. So I'll say that's the Gemara frames machlokes. So again, we'll see all of these sugyas, but just understand we were just introduced to two major yisodos, or two major machloksim, I should say. Number one, can an Eruv be made just for mitzvah purposes, even for mundane purposes, and mitzvos lav lehanos nitnu. So we'll say it appears from this sugya that we will adopt the position of mitzvos lav lehanos nitnu, which for our purposes means that the hana that one gleans from a mitzvah, from the performance of a mitzvah, is not halachic hana. That's not the hana that Chazal speak about. It is a benefit, but it's not halachic hana. What you can make an Eruv Tchumen for, stay tuned, we're going to see that sugya. So let's go back. The Mishnah says, "Ma'avin b'dmai ub'mai serishon shnit la chumaso." This is an interesting case. You can make an Eruv with dmai. So let's remember again, what's dmai? Dmai is the produce of an Ama Aretz. The concern was, I don't know if the Ama Aretz, who's just, what's we say, Ama Aretz, he's not well versed in halacha. I don't know, did he take proper tithes or not? So therefore, the halacha when it comes to dmai is that you must retithe your produce. You must retithe it because you don't know what it is. Yet, interestingly enough, you can make an Eruv with Demai. Meiser Rishon shnit la truma. Let's remember again, Meiser Rishon, truma is given to the Kohen. Meiser Rishon is then given to the Levi. And the Levi has to remove what's called Trumas Meiser from his Meiser Rishon to give to the Kohen. So you can make an Eruv with Meiser Rishon that had his Trumas Meiser removed. Okay, again, we'll see the Chiddush in these statements. Or Meiser Sheni v'hektish sheniftu. Similarly, again, you can make an Eruv with Meiser Sheni. But again, Meiser Sheni is the tithe that belongs to the Yisrael. The only caveat is he must take it to Yerushalayim and eat it in Yerushalayim. So you could go ahead and make an Eruv with Meiser Sheni or with Hekdish, which have been redeemed. V'akohanim b'chalo. And a Kohen can make an Eruv with Chalo. And again, Chalo is the portion of the dough that you go and you give to the Kohen. So the Gemara says, "Avalo b'tevel," but you cannot go ahead and make an Eruv with tevel. So also remember again, tevel is untithed produce. Nor can you go ahead and make an Eruv with meiser rishon that has not had its trumas meiser removed. Nor can you make an Eruv with meiser sheni or hektish which have not been redeemed. Okay, so let's analyze. Says the Gemara, Demai halo chazile. So the Gemara says, I don't understand, how can you make an Eruv with Demai? Right, Demai is not usable. Well, so again, remember, what we've spoken about before is you can make an Eruv with really whatever you want. As long as what? As long as what? As long as someone could eat it. In other words, we've gone so far to say, even if you, the Eruv maker, cannot go ahead and eat it, as long as someone can eat it, it's fine. But Demai, who's allowed to eat Demai? To which the Gemara says, "Migo di by mafkilu l'nechasei v'havi ani v'chazulei hashtag nami chazulei." So listen to this. What could you do? Who is allowed to eat demai? Interestingly enough, a pauper. An ani is permitted to eat demai. So technically speaking, you could instantaneously impoverish yourself. How? Make all of your property hefker. Right? Everything's hefker. I hereby declare everything I own hefker. If I do that, then ultimately I have no possessions. If I have no possessions, I'm an ani. If I'm an ani, I can eat demai, thereby going ahead and making demai permissible for consumption. This nan we learn machilas haniyim demai. You are allowed to give the poor demai to eat. Amud Beis, Ves Achsanya Demai. Both you can also give an Achsanya. And Rashi points out over here, Achsanya is Chayalos Malchi Yisrael Shematilin Osan Al Bnei Ir Lezonon Vavilu Kaniyim Shar'im Einon Bivasehen. So we'll listen to this. So Achsanya are soldiers of the king, of the Jewish king that were quartered in Jewish homes or in Jewish cities. You could give them Demai. You could give those soldiers Demai because the soldier outside of his home is like an ani. It's like an ani, therefore it can be fed demai. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna, Tana Beishamai Omrim Ein Machilas Haniyim Demai, Ubeis Hillel Omrim Machilas Haniyim Demai. So apparently it's a machlokes Beishamai Beis Hillel. Beishamai is saying you cannot give demai to the ani. Beis Hillel is saying you can give demai to the ani. The Mishnah clearly reflecting the view of Beis Hillel, and therefore halacha lamaisa you could make an eruv with demai. I can't eat demai. I could if I'm mafkir all of my property. Right, renounce ownership all of my property, plunge myself into instantaneous poverty. An ani is permitted to go ahead and eat demai. Good. So we'll say, remember the next thing the Mishnah said was, if you have Meiser Rishon that had its Trumas Meiser, so remember again, the Meiser Rishon is the portion given to the Levi. The Levi then removes Trumas Meiser and gives that to the Kohen. So if you have Meiser Rishon that had its Trumas Meiser removed, you can use that for Eruv. So Pshita. The Gemara says, okay, I mean, what's the Kiddush? That is a permitted item. Lo tzricha shekdimu b'shibalin v'notla mimenu Trumas Meiser v'notla mimenu Truma Gidola. Oh, I will say, watch this case. What's the case over here? The case here, I will say, is where the Levi was a little bit pushy, and what did he do? The Levi took his portion of Meiser Rishon while the grain was still in its stalks, literally b'shibalin. He came. Imagine the scene over here. So the Levi comes to the Yisrael. The Yisrael has his grain, but the grain hasn't been processed into anything. It's still grain. It's bundles of grain. The Levi comes along and takes his portion of Meiser Rishon before the Kohen's Truma is separated. In other words, we'll say normally, first you separate out Truma, then from the remaining stock you go ahead and you separate out the Meiser Rishon. This Levi wants to get a little bit of a larger portion, so he wants his Meiser Rishon separated before you separate out the Truma of the Kohen. And what happens? So Shekdino b'shibal and v'notla mimenu Trumas Meiser v'lo notla mimenu Truma Gidola. So we'll say, in this case, interestingly enough, what happens over here is as follows. So the Levi gets his Meiser Rishon portion from the bundles of grain first, before any Truma has ever been removed. Then the Levi goes ahead and separates out the Trumas Meiser for the Kohen from his grain. So the Levi takes his Meiser Rishon, separates out his Trumas Meiser, gives that to the Kohen. But yet, interestingly enough, what we call Truma Gidola, regular Truma, the first tithe, has not been taken out from it yet. Ukit Rabbi Avo, Amrei Shlakish, Dam Rabbi Avo, Amrei Shlakish, Meiser Rishon Shekdimu b'Shibalin, Pater Truma Gidola. So we'll say, because Reish Lakish says as follows, that if you have a case where Meiser Rishon is separated out from the bundles of grain before Truma Gidola, that grain is exempt from Truma Gidola. Shene'emar, v'harimose mimenu Trumas Hashem ma'aser min ha'ma'aser. Because the pasuk says, remember, this is talking about the Trumas Meiser of the Leviim. You'll go ahead and you will tell the Leviim that when they take their Meiser, they have to give Meiser min ha-Meiser, tithing from that which has already been tithed. So the Gemara says, Meiser min ha-Meiser ma'atelecha, v'lo Truma Gidolo, Trumas Meiser min ha-Meiser. So both say, listen to this. So therefore, there's a technicality over here. The technicality over here is, if the Levi goes ahead and takes his Meiser Rishon portion before Truma Gidola has been dispensed, and then he gives his Trumas Meiser from his Meiser Rishon, that produce is exempted from any further Truma Gidola allocation. So the Chiddush over here, Abosai, when we speak about Meiser Rishon that had its Trumas Meiser taken out of it, could be used for an Eruv, we're talking about Trumas Meiser that was separated from Meiser Rishon, which was illegally taken, was taken before the Truma Gidola itself was separated out. And again, that type of produce essentially becomes exempted from Truma Gidola based on a technicality. So why is this only if the Levi only comes and separate and takes his portion from the bundles of grain? Even about say if you have a pile, the kri means a pile. Pile means, in this context, that pile of grain is grain that is already ready to be, is already in the process of being processed. It's already semi-processed. So it sounds like the only time that the produce will be exempted from Truma Gedola is if the Levi came along and took his Meiser Rishon, then separated as Trumas Meiser when it was still bundles of grain. But apparently if it was piled, this wouldn't work. Why not? So we'll say, because you have another pasuk that says, from all of your maestros shall you go ahead and separate out truma. So we'll say, which tells you that sometimes even if the Levi takes his portion first, you still have to separate out truma gedolah. And I will say, now, so what's the difference? In other words, apparently what the Gemara is teaching me is there are times where if the Levi takes his portion first, I will still subsequently separate out truma gedolah, and sometimes I won't. So we'll say, everything depends when the Levi takes his portion. If the Levi goes in and takes his portion while the grain is still in bundles, it's not yet called grain. So because it's not yet called grain, the obligation of Truma Gedolah has not yet devolved upon it. So if the Levi takes his Meiser Rishon while it's still in stalks, and then he separates out his Trumas Meiser, that produce is exempted from Truma Gedolah. But once the grain is piled, it's already called dagan. It's already called grain. And once it's called grain, the obligation of Truma Gedolah is already devolved upon it. Therefore, even if the Levi comes along and takes his Meiser Rishon first, Truma Gedolah still must be separated, because once it's called dagan, once it's called grain, then halacha lamaisa, you must separate out Truma Gedolah. So apparently, when it's in bundles, it's called wheat, it's not yet called grain. Because it's only called wheat and not yet grain, technically speaking, you could circumvent the obligation for Truma Gedolah. Once it's grain, that obligation devolves upon it. So even if the Levi disrupts the normal order of tithe dispensation, or tithe dispensing, I should say, then halacha l'maisa, you still have to get Truma Gedolah. Good. So we'll say, so to kind of wind this back, so the chiddush is that when the Mishnah says that you can make an eruv out of Meiser Rishon shenitla Trumaso, what are we talking about? We're talking about this case where the Levi got his Meiser Rishon before the Levi got his Truma Gedolah. The Levi separated out Trumas Meiser, and now this produce becomes exempted from Truma Gedolah. For some reason, I guess you might have thought that halacha l'maisa, you can't use this type of grain for an eruv. Kamash Malon, you can. Good. Or Meiser Rishon, Meiser Sheni v'hektish niftu. You could also use Meiser Sheni and hektish which are redeemed. Pshita, isn't that obvious? We'll say, what's the case? Remember, in order to redeem Meiser Sheni, you have to do two things. You have to go ahead. Yeah, well, I should say, the truth is, I take it back. In order to redeem any type of hektish, what you have to do is, you have to go ahead and pay the principal plus a fifth. Plus a fifth. It's like a hektish surcharge. So we'll say, what's the case? The case is where you redeemed the Meiser Sheni, or you redeemed the hektish. You paid the principal, but you have not yet paid the fifth. The kamash malon de'ein hachomesh ma'akev. And we'll say, what does it teach us? It teaches us that once you have paid the principal, the item is considered to be redeemed, and the non-payment of the fifth does not prevent the deconsecration of the item. Obviously, you still have to pay the fifth, right? That's an obligation, that's a chov that you have to the Beis HaMikdash, but the non-payment of the fifth does not go ahead and prevent deconsecration from occurring. Good. Avalo b'tevel, but you can't use tevel, right, which is untithed produce. So pshita, the Gemara says, of course, isn't that obvious that you can't use tevel for an eruv? Lo tzricha b'tevel tavel midirabanan. But so what are we talking about? Tevel midirabanan. What's the case of tevel midirabanan? Kigon shezaro ba'atit she'enon nokov. So we'll say, what's the case? The case is where you planted produce in a non-perforated flower pot. So we'll say, remember again, the case of a non-perforated flower pot, it's not really considered to be mechubel l'karka. Because it's not mechubel l'karka, therefore, halacha l'maisa, it's not chayv and shumas ha'maisa midaraisa, but it is chayv midirabanan. And therefore, if you fail to tithe it, it's tevel midirabanan. So therefore, the Mishnah teaching me, you could go ahead, you cannot make an eruv, even with tevel midirabanan. V'lo b'maisa rishon shelo nitla trumaso, nor can you go ahead and use Meiser Rishon, whose truma has not been taken. So the Gemara says, Pshita. Again, isn't that obvious? Of course you can't use Meiser Rishon, will say, that hasn't had trumas Meiser removed from it. Halacha l'maisa, again, can't be used. To which the Gemara says, Pshita, lo tzricha shekdimo bekri, v'natla mimenu trumas meiser. So again, this reference is back to what we said before. What's the case? The case is where I got the meiser rishon while it was in the pile. So remember, different than the case we said before. The case we said before was the Levi went and he got his meiser rishon while the grain was still in bundles. In this case over here, the grain is already piled. It's already called dagan. So remember again, the Levi still came before the Kohen, got his portion, and Truma Gedola has not been removed from it. So the Gemara says, so you might have thought that would be okay, because you might have thought the case where the grain is in the pile is just like when the grain is in bundles. So it goes back to what we said before, that halacha l'maisa, if the Levi is coming once the grain is piled, even though he took his meiser rishon before the Kohen took his Truma Gedola, nevertheless, again, Truma Gedola must be separated, because once it's in a pile, it's called grain. Once it's called grain, there's an obligation of Truma Gedola which devolves upon it. Good. You can't use meiser sheni and hektish which were not redeemed. So pshita, that's obvious. That's obvious. I will say, what's the case? The case is where you redeemed the meiser sheni and the hektish, but you just didn't redeem it fully appropriately. For example, meiser shepado agav asimon v'rachmana amar v'tzarta kesef sheish alav tzura. So I will say, what's an example of an incomplete redemption of meiser sheni? So I'll say, remember again, how do you redeem meiser sheni? You go ahead and you transfer the sanctity of the produce onto money. You take the money into Yerushalayim and use it to buy food items. So remember again, the lashon of the pasuk is v'tzarta kesef. Now v'tzarta kesef literally means you will bundle the money and take it with you to Yerushalayim. The Gemara dashens over here that it's telling you the type of money you have to use. You can only use minted money. Right, literally money with an image on it. You can't use, I guess, what they called an asimon, right? Not to make phone calls in Eretz Yisrael. Right? What they meant, an asimon is an unminted coin. An unminted coin. So I guess it's like what you call like a slug. Like it's a piece of metal, but because it doesn't have a tsura, because it doesn't have an image on it, it's hard to use it for commerce purposes. So halacha l'maisa, in order to go ahead and redeem meiser sheni, you have to redeem it onto usable currency. And the definition of usable currency is currency which has an image on it. So the case over here, I will say, with meiser rishon that was not redeemed, it doesn't literally mean it wasn't redeemed, because that's obvious. You can't use meiser rishon that wasn't redeemed for your eruv. What it means is meiser sheni which was redeemed, it just wasn't redeemed in a totally appropriate way. You used unminted coinage. So in that case, you cannot use that meiser sheni as eruv for your eruv, because the meiser is not totally usable. What's the case of hegdish? Hegdish shechilu agav karka d'rachmana amar v'nasan ha'kesef v'kama. What would be the case of not fully deconsecrated hektish, where you redeemed hektish onto land? So I will say the halacha is you could go ahead and deconsecrate hektish by transferring its sanctity onto money. You cannot go ahead and transfer sanctity of hektish onto real estate, just based on a pasuk. The pasuk says, "V'nasan hakesef v'kamlo." You will go ahead and pay the money, and the item becomes yours. That's a reference to deconsecration. You want to deconsecrate a piece of wood from the Beis Hamikdash? No problem. Pay the Beis Hamikdash the value plus the fifth. The sanctity is transferred onto the money. The piece of wood becomes chulin. But you can't deconsecrate hektish onto real estate. So therefore, what the Mishnah is teaching me is if you deconsecrated meiser sheni on an unminted coin, or you deconsecrated hektish onto real estate, that's not proper deconsecration, and therefore those items cannot be used for eruv. Beautiful. Says the Mishnah. We'll say it's at least being in the Mishnah today. Hasholech eruv bi'at cherish shot of the cotton. What's the interesting case? If I send my eruv in the hand of a cheresh, deaf mute, shota, someone who lacks mental capacity, literally insane, or katan, a minor. Or I will say, listen to this, I send my eruv in the hands of someone who does not subscribe to the concept of eruv. Rashi says like a kusi. Right, the kusi, someone who says, I don't believe in eruv. What's the halacha? Eino eruv. So I will say, so again, in this case over here, what you're doing is, you're appointing someone as a shaliach to go ahead and place your eruv in the makom shvisa, the place that you want to acquire as your domicile. So the chiddush of the Mishnah is, in order for that person to be able to do that, they must possess capacity. So therefore, a cheresh shot of the cotton can't do it. Similarly, someone who doesn't believe in eruv can't be your shaliach for eruv either. So the Gemara says, this is interesting. If let's say you put the eruv in the hand of a cheresh shot of the cotton, or an akusi, and you say, listen, deliver this Eruv to Ruvain, and Ruvain is going to be my shaliach to establish the makom shvisa, that works. That works. Okay, so says the Gemara, the katan lo, is that true that a katan can't be relied upon to go ahead and place the Eruv down to acquire makom shvisa? V'amar Rav Huna, katan goves ha'eruv. Rav Huna said a katan is permitted to collect the Eruv. Rashi says over goves ha'eruv b'nei chatzim arvanim. Supposed to say, so gove, the lashon of collection means an Eruv chatzeros. Remember again, Eruv chatzeros, a bunch of people living in the same courtyard. So the way all those domiciles have to join into one joint home. So you collect a little bit of food from everyone, deposit the food in one person's home, and then everyone is considered to be a resident of one home. So a katan's permitted to do that, to which the Gemara says very simple, lokash, it's not a contradiction, kan be'eruve tchumin, kan be'eruve chatzeros. Rabosai, it depends what kind of Eruv you're talking about. So an Eruv chatzeros, Rabosai, which essentially, again, only requires, look at Rashi, the Eruv chatzeros, de ruve rishusayo ba'ama, hilchach memeila me'are, va'afagav dein maisa katan klum, lo ichpas lon kidisan lekamon, balabai shayashosef em shchenav ein tzarach la'are, v'aleru, so listen to this. Eruv chatzeros, Rabosai, doesn't really require any type of real das. In other words, all that has to happen over here is everyone must contribute food, and that food must be placed in one home. Once everyone contributes, the fact that the katan is the one who's going ahead and collecting it, the katan is not creating the effectiveness of the Eruv. The effectiveness of the Eruv is a de facto reality once everyone contributes food, and that food is placed in someone's own. Or to say a little bit differently, you know what the katan is like in the case of Eruv Chatzeros? He's just like a shopping cart. He's just a shopping cart. So he's the shopping cart into which everyone is depositing their stuff, and that's it. That's very different than Eruv Tchumin. But I'll say, what does Eruv Tchumin require? Eruv Tchumin requires you to acquire a makom shevisa. You must acquire a domicile. You must place the food down in a particular place, and that's already much more significant. That already requires das, and therefore, again, a cheder shot of a cotton will not be entrusted or not permitted to go ahead and do this. We'll say fundamental difference. For Eruv Chatzeros, even someone without das can make it happen. For Eruv Tchumin, someone without das is not trusted. What's an example of someone who doesn't agree with Eruv? Man, Amrav Chista Kusai, Akusi. So ultimately, again, Kusi, someone who doesn't believe in Eruv. Good. Amr la'achar lekablo imenu. Let's go a little bit weiter. So Amr la'achar lekablo imenu harei Eruv. Supposedly, we'll begin this sugya today. So remember again, the Mishnah says something very interesting, which is, on one hand, I cannot allow a cherish shota v'katan to go ahead and create the Eruv for me. They cannot create an Eruv Tchumin for me. Eruv Chatzeros apparently yes, Eruv Tchumin no. But interestingly enough, what I can do is utilize the katan as a messenger. So I can say, katan, cherish shota katan, kusi, go deliver this Eruv to Ruvain, and Ruvain's going to make the Eruv Tchumin for me. And that's okay. The Gemara says, how do you know the katan's going to bring it? I'm using katan just as the example, as representative of that entire group. Both say, what's the idea? The idea is I'm standing, I'm watching the katan go. So I see him actually transport the Eruv to Ruvain. But how do I know that Ruvain is going to actually take the Eruv from the katan and do what I asked him to do? Because we'll say there's a chazaka that a shaliach does what he is appointed to do. So too in this case over here, the way the Gemara is setting it up is I see the katan delivering it to Ruvain, and once it gets to Ruvain's hand, there is a chazaka that a shaliach carries out his appointed agency. Where that concept comes from and how else we apply it, it merits Hashem to be seen tomorrow. Shkach